On Christmas Eve, 1985, while most of Jacksonville was wrapping gifts and falling asleep to the glow of Christmas lights, a stranger slipped into a teenager's apartment and turned a night of hope into a lifetime of horror for one family. And for almost 36 years, nobody knew his name. This is the horrific Christmas Eve abduction of 17-year-old Leslie McCray. Tonight, we're going back to the quiet streets of Jacksonville, Florida, to a small apartment near the St. Johns River, where a young woman was dreaming about her future, completely unaware that someone else was already planning how to take it away. So grab a drink, settle in, and stay with me until the end, because this case shows how one night can haunt a family for decades, and how a tiny trace of DNA can finally force a hidden monster into the light. Jacksonville, Florida, in December 1985, looked like the kind of place where bad things happened somewhere else. The city was growing, but neighborhoods still felt small, almost like little towns tucked along the river and under the orange haze of streetlights. Along St. John's Avenue, Christmas decorations glowed from apartment windows, plastic Santas sat on balconies, and the air held that strange mix of cool night breeze and the leftover heat of a Florida day. Inside one of those modest apartments lived 17-year-old Leslie McCray. Leslie wasn't a troubled kid. She wasn't living on the edge. She wasn't mixed up in crime. She was a college student, an everyday girl who'd done what society tells you to do. Study hard, stay close to family, mind your business, and trust that the world will give you a chance to grow up. Friends and family remembered her as soft-spoken but determined, the kind of girl who wrote down goals in notebooks and stayed up late talking about the future. She loved the holidays, loved the lights, the music, the feeling that the year was ending and something new and better was just around the corner. On December 23rd, rolling into the early hours of December 24th, Leslie was at home in her Jacksonville apartment, not out at some wild party, not walking alone down a dark alley. She was where we all feel safest, in her own bed, with someone she trusted. Her boyfriend was there too, drifting in and out of sleep, the sounds of the night filtered by thin apartment walls, distant cars, the muffled laugh of a neighbor, the faint hum of a TV through the floor. Christmas Eve was only hours away. Gifts were waiting, family plans were made, and if you'd walked past that building in the early morning darkness, you would have seen nothing but a normal home on a normal street. But behind that thin front door, something was already wrong. Somewhere nearby, a man was moving with intention. He knew there were people inside that apartment. He knew he could get in, and he had a weapon. In the early morning hours, around 3 a.m., when the city was at its quietest, a stranger entered Leslie's apartment. To this day, investigators say he came in by unknown means. No shattered glass, no kicked-in door that would have warned the neighbors. One moment the apartment was calm, the next there was someone else in the room who did not belong there. Leslie's boyfriend woke up to the sight of a man kneeling beside the bed. Imagine that for a second. You open your eyes expecting to see the person you love or the familiar outline of your room, and instead you see a stranger, close enough to touch, armed, focused, already in control. The intruder had a knife. In the terrifying moments that followed, he tied them up, both Leslie and her boyfriend, using whatever he had brought or found in the apartment. Hands bound, helpless, the room shrinking with every breath. We don't know every word that was said in that room, what Leslie begged, what the intruder demanded. We do know this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a quick grab and dash. The man didn't just take their things, he took Leslie. Once he was satisfied that the boyfriend was secured, the intruder forced Leslie out of the apartment and toward the back door, taking her away into the night. Her boyfriend watched, tied and powerless, as the girl he loved was dragged out of their home. That image would stay with him for the rest of his life. When the apartment door finally closed, the silence must have been deafening. Time stretches in shock, and no clock can measure what it feels like to lie tied up, replaying the last few minutes in a loop, wondering if this is real, wondering if she's still alive. Somehow, Leslie's boyfriend managed to get free. Adrenaline, panic, raw survival kicked in. As soon as he was able, he called the police. In an instant, this quiet Christmas Eve morning turned into a crime scene. Officers rushed to the St. John's Avenue apartment, lights flashing blue and red against Christmas decorations, waking up neighbors who peeked through blinds to see what was happening. The story they heard from the young man inside was the beginning of a nightmare. A stranger, a knife, both of them tied up, Leslie taken against her will out the back door. There wasn't time to waste. Police started searching the area, canvassing the neighborhood, shining flashlights into alleys and yards, hoping that somehow the kidnapper had panicked and left her nearby, alive and waiting to be found. But deep down, everyone understood how dangerous this was. A man who breaks into a home with a knife, ties two people up, and chooses to take one with him is not thinking about mercy. As the sun rose over Jacksonville, officers expanded the search. They followed leads, retraced possible routes from the apartment to the surrounding roads, and checked places where someone might dump a body or abandon a terrified girl after having done the unthinkable. Hours later, on Old Middleburg Road on Jacksonville's west side, that fear became reality. Along the side of the road, not far from Interstate 295, searchers found Leslie. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed multiple times, including a fatal wound to her neck. Her life ended alone by the roadside on what was supposed to be the most hopeful morning of the year. The news broke her family. Christmas would never be Christmas again. For them, December 24th was no longer about carols or church or wrapped gifts. It was the day their daughter's body was found on the side of a road. Detectives now had two scenes, the apartment on St. John's Avenue and the place where Leslie's body was discovered. At the apartment, they looked for fingerprints, fibers, any sign of forced entry they might have missed. They collected bindings, checked for unknown prints on doors and surfaces, and tried to piece together exactly how the attacker had moved in that space. On Old Middleburg Road, they worked carefully around Leslie's body, documenting the scene in detail, photographing footprints, tire marks, anything that might point to the route her killer took. Evidence was bagged and sent to the lab. Back at the station, investigators did what they always do, started from the inside out. They interviewed Leslie's boyfriend repeatedly, picking apart the timeline, checking for inconsistencies, looking for any sign that the intruder's story was a cover. In most violent crimes, the person closest to the victim is looked at first, not because the police want to blame someone innocent, but because statistically, that's where answers are often found. But in this case, the details he gave lined up with the physical evidence. He had injuries that matched being tied up. The bindings were real, the scene was real, and nothing suggested he had staged it. Whatever had happened that night, someone else had been there. Detectives also talked to neighbors. Did anyone see a stranger hanging around before Christmas Eve? Any unfamiliar car sitting idling outside the building late at night? Any man who didn't belong there, watching? People reported fragments, a car they didn't recognize, a sound in the middle of the night they thought was just someone arguing, a shadow on a staircase, but nothing concrete, nothing that pointed cleanly at one name, one suspect. And then there was the question that haunts so many cases. Was this random, or was Leslie targeted? Did this man know her schedule, know she'd be home that night, know there'd be a boyfriend he'd have to neutralize? Or was he a predator roaming Jacksonville's streets in the early morning hours, looking for any open door, any opportunity? The crime lab worked the physical evidence with the tools they had in 1985. DNA was in its infancy as a forensic tool. They could test fluids, look at blood types, analyze hairs, but the powerful DNA databases we know today simply didn't exist. They were boxing with one hand tied behind their backs. Detectives chased down leads that fizzled out. A man rumored to brag about hurting women turned out to be all talk. Another with a history of violence had a solid alibi. A suspicious car seen near the apartment belonged to a teenager out too late, guilty of bad judgment and nothing more. Months turned into a year, and the case that had once dominated the Jacksonville news began to fade from the front page. For Leslie's family, the silence was torture. Her mother, Sarah, refused to let her daughter become just another cold case file shoved into a cabinet. She called, she wrote, she asked questions. She kept Leslie's memory alive at every holiday, every birthday that Leslie never got to celebrate. Her cousin Joey, who grew up with her more like sisters than cousins, took on the role of spokesperson for the family, refusing to let the city forget what had happened on that Christmas Eve. Then life did what life does. It kept moving. New tragedies demanded attention. New cases landed on detectives' desks. Some of the original investigators retired. Evidence from Leslie's case was sealed and stored, labeled and shelved. For many people, the story of Leslie McCray became a sad memory from the mid-'80s, a case they assumed was unsolvable. But inside her family's home, the pain never left. Years later, Sarah would be diagnosed with ALS, a disease that slowly stole her ability to speak, to move freely, to physically push for answers the way she had done for so long. But even as her body failed her, her purpose stayed razor sharp. She wanted justice for Leslie. Decades passed. Somewhere in Michigan, a man named David Nelson Austin was serving life sentences for separate sexual assault convictions. He had been locked away in the early 90s for horrific crimes against young girls, and his name lived in prison paperwork, court transcripts, and the state's offender registry, but not yet in Leslie's case file. Those worlds were separate. At least, that's how it looked on paper. In Jacksonville, the holiday season continued to come and go, each December hitting the McCray family like a wave. The city grew, technology advanced, police work changed. And then, around 2019, something shifted. Leslie's family reached out again, this time connecting with a local nonprofit called Project Cold Case and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit. They weren't just asking politely anymore, they were insisting that the old evidence be re-examined using the newest tools. Cold case detectives agreed. They pulled Leslie's file, dusted off photographs that had yellowed at the edges, and opened sealed evidence that had not seen light in decades. Inside those boxes were items that had been collected from the apartment and from old Middleburg Road, physical traces of the man who took Leslie's life. Only now, for the first time, those traces could be run through systems that didn't exist in 1985. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement got involved. Forensic scientists used modern DNA technology to examine samples taken more than 30 years earlier. They built a usable DNA profile from what had once been limited, almost unusable evidence. And when they ran that profile through national databases, it hit. It matched a man already behind bars in Michigan. The name that came back was David Nelson Austin. According to investigators, this was the same man who had been living in Jacksonville at the time of the murder. The same man who later left Florida and went on to commit multiple sexual assaults in Michigan before being caught and sentenced to life in prison. Suddenly, the faceless intruder in Leslie's bedroom on that Christmas Eve had a name, a face, a history. Detectives went to Michigan to interview him, getting a direct DNA sample, and additional testing confirmed what the numbers suggested. The profile from Leslie's case and the profile from Austin matched. After 36 years, Jacksonville authorities announced that there had finally been a breakthrough. A grand jury indicted David Nelson Austin on charges including first-degree murder, armed kidnapping, and armed sexual battery connected to Leslie's abduction and death. Prosecutors began the process of bringing him back to Florida to stand trial, even as he remained a life-sentenced prisoner in Michigan. For Leslie's family, the news was a strange mix of relief and renewed grief. They had an answer, but answers don't bring people back. Her cousin Joey spoke about the questions that had haunted them for decades. Who did this? Why? What really happened in those final hours? And how knowing a name was both comforting and devastating. There was another twist to this story too, one that shows the ripples a crime like this sends out far beyond one city. In Michigan, a man named Owen received an email from his father, a father he had never really known. That father was David Austin. Owen told reporters that he had grown up with his dad already in prison, that he had no emotional connection to the man beyond the embarrassment of hearing his name in connection with terrible crimes. Their communication over the years had been limited, but nothing prepared him for the message he got in 2021. In the email, his father wrote, "I am being charged with a cold case murder and kidnapping in Florida from 1985. Imagine opening your inbox and reading that from a parent you barely know. For Owen, it was like discovering a bomb buried in his family history. He said that when he read the word murder, he felt shock more than anything, and when he heard the details about Leslie, he reached out to the media. He also said that when he confronted his father, Austin denied being Leslie's killer, asking in another email if denying it even mattered anymore. Legally, Austin stands accused, indicted on serious charges, and it will be up to the courts to decide his guilt or innocence in this particular case. But for investigators, the DNA evidence tells a compelling story. A man who lived in Jacksonville in 1985, who later went on to commit similar violent crimes in another state, left biological traces at both of the scenes connected to Leslie's final night. For the detectives who had worked the case, both past and present, the breakthrough was like a weight lifting off their shoulders. They had always believed someone out there knew what had happened. It turned out the answer had been sitting quietly in an evidence box the whole time, waiting for science to catch up. So what does the ending of this story look like? On one level, you can say the case is solved because there is a name, an indictment, a path to legal accountability. The unknown intruder is no longer unknown. On another level, though, nothing about this feels clean or complete. Leslie's mother lives with a disease that stole her voice before she could stand in court and confront the man authorities say took her daughter. Her family has spent more Christmases without Leslie than they ever had with her. The boyfriend who watched her being taken away in the dark still has to live with those images, the helplessness of that night. And in Michigan, a son grapples with the reality that his father isn't just a name on a registry, he may also be the man behind one of Florida's most haunting Christmas Eve crimes. What keeps this story burning in people's minds is not just the brutality of what happened, a teenager kidnapped from her own bed at knife point and murdered on a holiday, but the long stretch of time in which it seemed like he had gotten away with it. For decades, the man who allegedly did this lived, moved, hurt other people, and likely believed he'd never be forced to answer for what he did in Jacksonville. But a few microscopic cells didn't forget. That's what modern forensics does. It gives memory to the smallest traces, so that even when human witnesses are gone or silent, the evidence can still speak. So as we wrap up this case, I want you to sit with a few things. Leslie was doing nothing wrong. She was at home with someone she loved on the edge of adulthood, on the edge of Christmas. Her story is a reminder that random, predatory violence can rip through a quiet life with no warning. But it's also a reminder that families, when they refuse to give up, can push systems to act, can force old cases back into the light, and that sometimes, even after 36 years, the truth can still claw its way to the surface. If you're watching this and you remember Leslie's case, or you lived in Jacksonville back then, I'd love to hear your memories in the comments. How did this crime affect the way you felt about safety, about the holidays, about justice? And if this is your first time hearing about her, tell me what you think about the role of DNA and cold casework. Do you believe justice delayed can still be justice, or is it never enough when a life is taken this young? Before you go, please take a moment to honor Leslie by keeping her story alive. Hit the like button so more people see this video, share it with someone who loves true crime but also cares about real families behind the headlines. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case we cover. This was the horrific Christmas Eve abduction of 17-year-old Leslie McCray from Jacksonville, Florida. A case that shows evil can hide for decades, but it can't always hide forever. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.